God makes a number of covenants in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to focus on 3 of them. The first one is the Abrahamic covenant, which we'll eventually see is critical for the Apostle Paul's belief that Christians were eventually grafted onto this promise or onto this vine into the Abrahamic covenant, becoming one with those who understand themselves to be in a special relationship with God. Well, many people still speak of a covenant, and particularly the Abrahamic covenant, as a kind of promise, and a promise that's conditional. Many covenants, and particularly those from the ancient world, from which the biblical covenants come, of course, are more like a modern contract or an agreement between 2 people. In our day, of course, a contract usually becomes legally binding when 2 autonomous parties, right, sit down together and sign a document that details the terms of their agreement. And it's the signing of the document that actually enacts this covenant or agreement, this legally binding document. In a similar way, ancient covenants often became binding by killing and cutting animals. In the Hebrew Bible, the word barith is derived from a root which means to cut. Hence, a covenant is a kind of cutting. It refers to the cutting or dividing of animals into 2 parts laid open on their sides. So you cut the animal and then you lay them on their sides, sometimes one, sometimes many, and you make a path down the middle. And the contracting parties then would pass between the animals and thereby enact their covenant. Right? We have this language called cutting a deal, which is not so different. We also I have here a text from a covenant or an agreement that was made about 700 years before Jesus was born in the 8th century BCE. It was a treaty between King Ashurnirari of Assyria, Ashurnirari, and Matailu. I have no idea who Matailu is, but part of this treaty or covenant reads as follows. This spring lamb has been brought from its fold, not for sacrifice, not for a banquet, not for purchase. It has been brought to sanction the treaty between Ashurnirari and Matailu. If Matailu sins against this treaty made under the oath by the gods, then just as this spring lamb brought from its fold will not return to its fold, Matailu, together with his sons, daughters, officials, and the people of his land, will not return to his country, will not behold his country again. This head is not the head of a lamb. It's the head of Matailu. It's the head of his sons, his officials, and the people of his land. If Matailu sins against this treaty, just as the head of this spring lamb is torn off, may the head of Matailu be torn off as well. So these people took their covenants pretty seriously, right? Probably a lot more seriously than people tend to take agreements or covenants today. You don't, after all, still tear people's heads off if they renege on their agreements. So the Lord enacts the covenant with Abraham, right? The Lord said to Abram, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, and a she-goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." And Abram brought all these, cut them in 2, laid them each half over against the other. Again, he laid them apart and made a path down the middle. Now as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And lo, a dread and great darkness fell upon him. And then the Lord said to Abram, "Know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there. And they will be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation which they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age." And when the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Now, This is kind of interesting because in Exodus, we hear about God leading out the Israelites, leading them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. It's a very similar kind of picture, right? A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. God's passing between these pieces. And notice that Abram is asleep. God's brought this sleep. A great darkness fell upon Abram. And then God alone walks along this path between the cut pieces. That's different than the one where both partners walk up and down this path. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land." Circumcision, as I expect most of you already know, is an ancient practice that's been carried out by Jewish parents for more than 3,000 years. It's a kind of initiation rite into the Jewish community. Normally, this takes place in a ceremony called a brit or a bris milah, with family and friends gathered around to welcome this new child into the community. Milah is Hebrew for covenant of circumcision. Notice it's a covenant of circumcision. And notice that covenant and circumcision go together here, right? In the first few verses of Genesis 17, God says to Abram, "I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you." And then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham." We'll come back to names later. Right? So this is the covenant of God. This is the covenant which you shall keep. This is Abraham's side. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He that is 8 days old among you, all the baby boys, shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Notice it's not genetic, right? Anybody in the household. Both he that is born in your house and he that is bought with your money shall be circumcised. And so shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Notice the covenant of circumcision is the remaking of the Abrahamic covenant for each of these individual boys. Any uncircumcised male who's not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people, for he has broken my covenant. Again, what I want you to see here is that the rite of circumcision, that Jewish practice, right, which is one of the key identifiers among the Hebrew people, it identifies them as Hebrew, is directly related to the Abrahamic covenant. It marks the Abrahamic covenant. Indeed, it is a remaking, in some sense, of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, what I want you to do is to go back to the worksheet at this point and look at what God is promising to Abraham. I mean, so far, we only know what Abraham's doing on his side. He's going to mark this covenant with the covenant of circumcision, which is God remaking the covenant in some sense. So what is the promise that God is making? And making, presumably, in an unconditional way, since Abraham could not walk between those animals. Only God was walking between. So God makes the covenant entirely on God's side, right? Abraham sleeps through the covenant. Okay? This is a gift, pure gift. So off you go, and I'll be back when you've read about what it is that God gives to Abraham.